Kia ora, ko Kevin Sweeney toko ingoa. He ka tohu, mā tamua aho. Ko te tauranga Aotearoa taku wahi mahi. E mahi ana aho ki poneke. No reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Sweeney, and I'm the Principal Advisor, Data and Analytics Consulting at Te Tauranga Aotearoa Stats NZ, based in the Wellington office. Today I'm pleased to be presenting on the important topic of data infrastructure, and in particular reflecting on how that idea has prompted a new level of attention and interest, following our experience with the COVID-19 pandemic here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The pandemic has in many ways reshaped our world, initiating a new normal as it's been described, which means more than ever that we need touch points of stability and certainty with which to fashion a successful response and establish an approach to long-term recovery that ideally equips us to thrive in this new situation. One fairly consistent theme reflecting that idea and incorporating our collective pandemic experience involves turning the disruption to our pre-crisis normal into an opportunity, a chance to enact genuine and sustained change for good. This has certainly been evident within the New Zealand government data system, where COVID-19 has highlighted the cracks in our existing data system, but has also spurred new thinking and innovation. The key is leveraging that experience to inform change that addresses persistent problems and positions us to better manage an uncertain future. Though it is still relatively early days, there have already been lessons from which we in government can draw to make improvements to our data system. I would mention too that the pandemic's reach has extended right into this talk itself, which was originally meant to discuss the concept of data infrastructure generally. But following the events of this year, I thought it more meaningful to present that topic through the lens of the COVID-19 pandemic and consider the role it might play in the government's response. There is, in fact, work already underway to capture and analyze the pandemic experience of government agencies so that it might inform positive change to the data system. For the last several months, I've been helping to develop a set of recommendations to improve the resilience of the New Zealand government data system. The resultant paper will be based on lessons learned by government agencies as they navigated their new realities following the national lockdown last March. My talk today draws extensively from that work, which, I can say, has reinforced the notion that data infrastructure is a critical and high-value area for development and investment, especially as a mechanism for strengthening our data system resilience. But before discussing the recommendations paper, it's worthwhile clarifying what is meant by data infrastructure, and based on that, understanding how it can better position us to manage another crisis should it occur. Here's a highly simplified definition that I'd like to use, especially when thinking about infrastructure in a data context. In my mind, this is the crux of the idea. It's all to do with facilitation, ultimately. But more practically, these are the sorts of things that constitute infrastructure for data. I would highlight the fact that the list includes a lot more than technology, so-called hard infrastructure, which is what many people settle on when they hear the term data infrastructure. It also includes several elements of so-called soft infrastructure, things like strategies, policies, and frameworks, all of which help guide those using data to get to where they need to go. So why is data infrastructure so important in a crisis in particular? Well, in a word, norms. Earlier this year, while we were at Alert Level 4 lockdown, I published a blog on data.gov.nz that talked about the importance of data norms, using the example of data governance. To illustrate that, we can start with a model that's often used, suggesting data that's collected becomes information, which in turn becomes knowledge, which in turn becomes wisdom, which supports and leads to action. But what isn't highlighted in that model, and what's especially evident in a crisis situation, is that this is also a path of assurance, one that leads to greater certainty. Moving to the right, from a crisis situation where uncertainty is rampant, we grow increasingly clear on what can be done and are better equipped to make decisions, and therefore take meaningful action. And those activities are what's needed to mitigate the uncertainty that shapes the crisis environment where we started. All of that movement towards more certainty, in the case of data, the transition from raw data to actionable intelligence, rests on a foundation of data infrastructure. And to reiterate, this data infrastructure facilitates those transitions, allows for that movement, guiding us away from uncertainty. But more than just providing a foundation upon which to travel, important as that is, data infrastructure also makes readily available and perpetuates our agreed set of data norms. Having those norms at our disposal, something we can reference and rely on, itself fosters even more certainty in something of a multiplier effect. And this reduction of what can be debilitating uncertainty, along with the associated challenges of confusion and hesitation that can surface in the moment, is crucial to the resolution of a crisis, and contributes to resilience. It's certainly a key enabler, allowing us to do without the need for extensive thinking, and the extent to which that's feasible is a good indicator of a successful response. The research to develop the COVID-19 recommendations paper has provided a view of what sorts of things have characterized people's data experience, at least to date, since the pandemic is still happening, of course. Unsurprisingly, these have begun to reflect patterns, including the following. Agility. As would be expected, there's a real need for agility, which in terms of data resilience involves the ability to efficiently implement different operating modes, along with the capacity to adapt and shift between those modes with little notice. Under our national alert system, where rules and conditions can change very rapidly, this level of responsiveness is particularly important. Data quality. While already good practice, a fit-for-purpose data quality approach becomes much more applicable during a crisis situation. In a crisis, especially during the initial response, this approach will typically involve the production of data with speed as the driver, shifting from what otherwise might be an emphasis on high quality. While that can seem counterintuitive, the conditions of a crisis will quickly overwhelm systems that are not able to relax quality requirements to speed up production and processing as needed. Governance. Crisis situations like the pandemic have demonstrated the value of central authority imbued with the ability to unambiguously direct response activities. The communication of explicit directions with clear, understood accountabilities is crucial to an effective response. This centralized governance model, which might only be enacted temporarily under an emergency powers scenario, for instance, is likewise effective in terms of data, where clarity on roles and understanding of acceptable changes in data practice is paramount. Inclusion. An important lesson highlighted by the pandemic is the need to capture and reflect specific communities in the data collected and used during a crisis. These would include groups considered at risk and adversely impacted in these situations. The outcomes and effects of decisions informed by the data that government collects plays out at the local level, and ethical data practice ensures that those affected have a say in how the data is gathered and used. Inclusion in this regard can cover a wide range of activities, from modeling data to reflect particular populations like Maori iwi or Pacifica, for example, to co-developing a data collection strategy with community partners. Statistics. While our focus is on data and good data practice in the pandemic, we must not forget its value is often realized through information that is derived from that data and commonly presented as statistics. Statistical outputs represent an easily ingested form of information, particularly useful for those without technical expertise and who might very well be in positions to make decisions or influence others. It is the responsibility of those producing statistical outputs to ensure underlying data processes and protocols are in place to provide assurance that the derived information is trustworthy. We found it helpful to think about these common themes collectively and acting as a set of requirements for data resilience. In that way, they could be referenced to test and shape the composition of the recommendations that we developed, ensuring that our results were at the very least comprehensive. Our research has further suggested that achieving improvements to data resilience, leading to increased levels of sustainability and endurance, inevitably comes down to investment alternatives and the decision process associated with them. In particular, there are important and sometimes challenging choices to be made regarding what elements of a data system require investment to establish them as persistent components, delivering value in both crisis and peacetime, versus those that only require activation during crisis response and therefore a more targeted investment approach. Likewise, there is a need to properly distribute investments between those that sit with individual agencies and therefore within the scope of their budget allocations, and those that result in system-level additions or improvements and therefore might require a collective contribution. And I might add that indications are that worthwhile investment in data, no matter what the time frame or scale, often involves adding new or improving existing data infrastructure. The process to develop a set of recommendations has been involved, requiring the collection, synthesis, and analysis of a large amount of raw data resulting from a series of interviews, focus groups, and literature review. The result of that work was a list of 46 recommendations, which group naturally into three categories: those to do with people, those to do with data and related processes, and those to do with governance and trust. For a final set of recommendations, we felt it worthwhile to prioritize the full list of 46 down to a shorter set that government agencies could more readily consider and take up. To prioritize, we applied a set of 8 criteria. These should be self-explanatory with the exception perhaps of the last 3. Resilience here means the ability to contribute across the timeframes associated with the crisis, from response to recovery to long-term readiness. Enabling has to do with dependency and refers to the extent to which a recommendation is required to, facilitates, or otherwise helps complete the successful delivery of data initiatives already circulating in government. The Government Chief Data Steward criteria is a consideration of the extent to which a recommendation supports the realization of that role as a data system lead. We recognize that there is work yet to be done to further raise the visibility of the GCDS and clarify the mandate associated with it, and the development of data resilience in New Zealand government offers a unique opportunity to do that. As it's not yet been agreed and published, I can't provide the final short list of recommendations, but I can highlight a few common ideas that have surfaced during the prioritization process. One of these has to do with the consideration of centralized and readily accessible collaboration platforms, not just for data itself, but for sharing advice and as a means of strengthening peer networks. There was also, interestingly, the idea of developing more formal sector-level governance within the New Zealand data system, so something at a level more specific than the entire system, but larger than an individual agency. Examples might include the health, education, financial, or natural resources sector, each of which would include a group of agencies with common data needs, like the consistent use of industry data standards. And importantly, we saw a common idea of increased transparency, which could improve the level of trust and inclusiveness associated with government. This might include partnering and co-developing data strategies with New Zealand's at-risk and adversely impacted communities, and embedding ethics as a core element of good data practice. As with any recommendations, the ultimate value of this set is dependent on the extent to which they are accepted and acted upon. Generating that acceptance involves conversations, particularly at the level of agency executive leadership, to consider what is feasible and what is most impactful, both for their respective organizations and for the wider government data system. Inevitably, for the COVID-19 data recommendations to deliver increased resilience, there will need to be compromises and a certain amount of putting aside agency-centric agendas for the broader good. That may require a shift away from traditionally risk-averse approaches and an openness to truly novel and innovative solutions. With that in mind, we are conscious that simply publishing a list of recommendations may not be helpful, so therefore have attempted to offer those tasked with having those conversations additional means with which to consider the recommendations. We have, for instance, created reference frames for time horizons and for associated roles and responsibilities, both of which are illustrated in this diagram. The blue circle references the 4 time and action horizons associated with a crisis situation like the current pandemic. Starting in the upper left quadrant is response, the earliest stage, which is characterized overwhelmingly by immediacy, a short-term focus having to react and do, often without proper time for thinking. It's all about quickly securing data at this stage and pushing out information products derived from it rapidly. As that calms, there is a transition to recovery, where thinking becomes more medium-term in scope, and the emphasis starts to shift to fixing what was upended by the crisis. Based on that, some data-driven investment might start to happen, and there's now the potential for the initiation of legitimate impact monitoring. As things continue to move further from the initial crisis event, there's a need to step back and take time for reflection in the reframe stage. Here, thinking shifts to the genuinely strategic and is more anticipatory in nature, with an emphasis on realignment, all of which is based on an assessment of what constitutes the new normal post-crisis. And lastly is the readiness stage, where strategic thinking is optimized with the goal of strengthened resilience. Here it's all about being prepared, being ready to take on the next crisis event should it occur in a way that is better than the last time and leverages the previous lessons. The thinking has been done and likely enacted by now, so that at the next response stage, those in the data system are equipped to act quickly and decisively. In addition, we have proposed a 3-part frame for considering the roles and responsibilities associated with implementing the recommendations, shown in this diagram as the gray triangle. The positioning of that triangle enforces the idea that the areas of responsibility it designates have potential roles to play across all 4 of the time horizons. First, there is the government data system itself, including at the bottom left point of the triangle, which consists of the collection of agencies across government. Their responsibilities involve implementing the recommendations in terms of what's relevant for their organization, while also contributing to the wider data system for the benefit of all. At the top of the triangle is the Government Chief Data Steward, the GCDS, which through its functional leadership designation is uniquely positioned to act as a central data and information authority in a crisis situation. heading up any data governance structures put in place. In addition to coordinating government agency data activity and providing clarity on best practice, the GCDS could also offer a public-facing role, providing assurance to help strengthen the government's social contract for data. The third area of responsibility at the bottom right point of the triangle sits with a collection of government leadership roles, each with a remit that involves to some extent data and information, and thereby a potential contribution to the realization of the recommendations. A few have been included here for consideration, including the Government Chief Digital Officer, the Government Chief Privacy Officer, the Government Chief Information Security Officer, the Government Statistician, and the Chief Archivist. Beyond contributing leadership in their respective areas, the active participation of these roles would also foster a more deliberately and consistently system-wide implementation of the recommendations, ensuring a joined-up approach across key areas like data collection, privacy, and security. So now to bring things back to data infrastructure. Considering that the research behind development of the recommendations and the proposed recommendations themselves support data infrastructure as a viable investment for improved resilience, there is good news to report. My team and others at StatsNZ have for some time now already been tasked with developing such infrastructure, the soft infrastructure that is, under the goal of helping lift data capability across the New Zealand data system. As a result, there's already a collection of such material available online, and more is in the works currently to be published soon. Here's a sample of some of the materials available with the website data.gov.nz serving as the online repository. There you can find information on a framework for data stewardship, for operational data governance, for data capability, and for applying Māori tikanga principles to encourage ethical collection and use of data. And there are cross-agency efforts currently underway to develop a consistent assessment for data maturity, as well as discussions around a new data quality framework for government that better reflects user perspectives on data. Once agreed, these will also be made available through data.gov.nz. In addition to publishing frameworks and guidance online, we also have the ability to provide initial on-site consulting support to help agencies establish things like data infrastructure or otherwise build data capability to take things forward on their own. So that concludes my talk this afternoon. Should you wish to contact me to discuss any of what you've heard today or anything data infrastructure related for that matter, here's my email. And as mentioned, the website data.gov.nz representing a good source of information on this topic, as well as an overview of the work StatsNZ is doing to lift capability across the New Zealand data system. Ngā mihi nui. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure to speak with you this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I'm happy now to take any questions if you have them in the time remaining.